Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. Let me ask you this, have you ever heard of a book that seems to hold secrets, a story so powerful, yet somehow it's been kept hidden from the mainstream? It's a book that's filled with courage, faith, and miraculous victories, yet it's been ignored or even censored by many. I'm talking about the first book of Maccabees, a piece of history and scripture that many of us have probably heard of, but few truly understand. Maybe you've seen the name, or even read some passages, but did you ever stop to wonder why this book isn't included in most of the Bibles we read today? Why has it been sidelined despite its incredible impact on the Jewish people, their faith, and even on Christian history? This book is not just a part of some ancient history, it's a story of rebellion, divine intervention, and the unshakable faith of a people fighting for survival. Here's the thing, the first book of Maccabees was once part of many early Christian Bibles. But as time went on, it was excluded, buried beneath layers of theological and political decisions. During the Protestant Reformation, figures like Martin Luther pushed for a revision of the Bible to align more closely with the Hebrew Scriptures, effectively removing books like Maccabees. But why was this particular book singled out? Why is it that this epic tale of defiance, faith, and miraculous victories was tucked away, while other stories remained? This is what we're going to explore. The first book of Maccabees is more than a forgotten text, it is a powerful testimony to the resilience of a people who, against all odds, stood firm in their belief in God's providence. It's a story of how the Maccabees, a family of priests and warriors, sparked a rebellion against one of the most tyrannical rulers of the time, Antiochus Epiphanes, to restore their right to worship and live according to God's laws. But why does this story matter to us today? It matters because the struggles of the Maccabees are not confined to the pages of history. Their story is relevant, it challenges us to think about our own faith, our own courage, and how we respond to oppression and adversity. This book shows us that faith can move mountains, that the battle between good and evil is not just a distant past event, but something that continues to unfold in our lives. So, why has this book been kept from most of us? What truths are hidden within its pages? Over the course of this video, we will uncover the powerful lessons of the Maccabees, a people who refused to compromise, even when their very existence was at stake. Get ready to learn about a story that has been hidden for far too long, one that speaks directly to our struggles, our beliefs, and our call to stand firm in faith, no matter the odds. When we talk about the Bible, the canon, and the process by which certain books were included or excluded, it's important to understand that it wasn't simply a matter of divine inspiration, it was also a historical and theological process that involved deep political and religious debates. The exclusion of the first book of Maccabees from many Western Bibles is tied to these larger developments, particularly during the Protestant Reformation. But to understand why, we need to look at the historical and theological context surrounding the creation of the Bible and the development of its canon. The first critical moment in this discussion lies in the development of the Hebrew Bible, what many people refer to as the Old Testament. The Hebrew canon, which was formed over several centuries, consists of texts that were accepted by the Jewish community as sacred and authoritative. This canon, however, did not remain static. Over time, different Jewish communities adhered to slightly different sets of scriptures, and the final list of what was included in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, was not settled until the first few centuries of the Common Era. The first book of Maccabees, which chronicles the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BCE, was written in Hebrew, and it was widely accepted by many Jewish communities, particularly in the Hellenistic world. However, it was never formally included in the Jewish canon, a decision that was solidified during the Council of Jamnia, c. 90 CE, when the rabbis of the time excluded certain books, likely because of their Greek influence and their content, which did not align with the Jewish Torah. As Christianity began to spread, early Christian communities relied on the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Septuagint included books that were later excluded from the Hebrew canon, including the first book of Maccabees. This meant that early Christians read and used these books as part of their sacred scriptures. For centuries, the first book of Maccabees was widely accepted in Christian circles and was included in the Old Testament of the early Christian Bibles. The Septuagint became particularly important because it was the version of the Bible used by Jesus and his apostles. Many of the Old Testament quotations found in the New Testament are from the Septuagint, and it was considered an authoritative text by early Christians, including those in the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic traditions. However, as Christianity became more established, particularly after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its state religion under Emperor Constantine, debates began to arise about the canonical status of certain books. The first major formalization of the Christian Bible took place during the Council of Hippo, 393 CE, and the Council of Carthage, 397 CE, which ratified the inclusion of Maccabees and other books in the Christian Old Testament. But this process wasn't universally accepted, and the Protestant Reformation would bring about further changes. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, led by figures such as Martin Luther, sought to reform the Catholic Church and return to what reformers considered the pure sources of Christianity. One of the significant outcomes of the Reformation was the challenge to the Catholic canon, which included several books not found in the Hebrew Bible. Among these were the first and second books of Maccabees, which were part of the deuterocanonical books, texts considered sacred by the Catholic and Orthodox churches but not included in the Jewish canon. Luther and other Protestant reformers rejected these additional books, arguing that they were not part of the Hebrew scriptures and did not carry the same authority. Luther, in his 1534 translation of the Bible into German, placed the deuterocanonical books in a separate section, calling them Apocrypha, meaning they were of secondary importance but still worth reading. Luther's views gained traction, and soon after, most Protestant denominations followed suit by excluding the first book of Maccabees and other similar texts from their Bibles. This exclusion, however, was not due to any inherent flaws in the content of the first book of Maccabees. The book itself was considered to be historically accurate, and it provided a rich historical account of the Jewish revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, as well as a spiritual narrative that emphasized the importance of faith and courage in the face of oppression. Maccabees was a powerful reminder of God's role in human affairs, a theme that resonated deeply with the Protestant reformers' call to return to the Scriptures. The rejection of the Maccabees had more to do with theological and political concerns, specifically the desire to align the Christian Bible more closely with the Hebrew Bible. The first book of Maccabees is an invaluable historical document, offering insights into a critical moment in Jewish history. It describes the Maccabean revolt, 167 to 160 BCE, led by the priestly family of the Hasmoneans, against the Seleucid Empire. This revolt was sparked by the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes, who attempted to force the Jewish people to abandon their religion and adopt the customs of Greek Hellenism. His actions included the desecration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the outlawing of Jewish practices, including circumcision and Sabbath observance. In response, the Maccabees, under the leadership of Matthias and his son Judas Maccabeus, led a rebellion that resulted in the liberation of Jerusalem and the rededication of the temple. This event is commemorated in the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. The first book of Maccabees provides a detailed and dramatic account of this struggle, focusing on the heroism, courage, and faith of the Jewish people in the face of persecution. Importantly, the first book of Maccabees is historically reliable. Archaeological evidence and other historical texts support the events described, confirming the accuracy of its narrative. It is also rich in spiritual and moral teachings, offering a vision of resistance to tyranny, the importance of religious freedom, and the power of faith in times of trial. Despite being excluded from the Protestant Bible, the first book of Maccabees continues to have a lasting influence in other traditions, especially in the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Ethiopian Orthodox communities, where it is considered part of the canon. It has influenced countless theologians, scholars, and activists throughout history who have drawn inspiration from its themes of courage, resistance, and divine intervention. Today, the first book of Maccabees serves as an important reminder of the ongoing struggle for religious freedom and the necessity of standing firm in one's beliefs, no matter the cost. It is a book that speaks to the timeless human experience of fighting for justice and preserving identity in the face of overwhelming opposition. The first book of Maccabees is not just a historical account, but a crucial document that captures one of the most significant crises in Jewish history. Its narrative unfolds during a time of intense political, cultural, and religious tension under the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who sought to impose Hellenistic culture and religion on the Jewish people. To understand the significance of this book, we must first explore the historical backdrop that set the stage for these events, as well as the pressures that threatened the very existence of Jewish faith and identity. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, his vast empire was divided among his generals, giving rise to several Hellenistic kingdoms. Judea, the homeland of the Jewish people, fell under the control of the Seleucid Empire, one of the most powerful of these successor states. By the time Antiochus Epiphanes ascended the throne in 175 BCE, the Seleucid Empire was struggling with internal dissent and external threats. In response, Antiochus pursued a policy of cultural and religious unification, seeking to solidify control over his territories by imposing Greek customs, language, and religion on his diverse subjects. Antiochus IV's vision of a unified empire led to a series of increasingly oppressive decrees targeting Jewish religious practices. Traditional Jewish customs, such as circumcision, observing the Sabbath, and following dietary laws, were outlawed. In an attempt to eradicate Jewish worship, Antiochus ordered the construction of altars to Greek gods in Jewish towns and even within the temple in Jerusalem. This act of desecration is described in 1 Maccabees 154. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of burnt offering. This desolating sacrilege refers to the installation of an altar to Zeus in the Jewish temple, a violation so profound that it symbolized not just political domination, but also spiritual conquest. The sacred spaces of the Jewish people were defiled, and their most cherished religious practices were criminalized. The policies of Antiochus went beyond the mere enforcement of Hellenistic traditions. They represented a direct assault on Jewish identity. The Torah, the central text of Jewish law and faith, was banned, and copies of it were publicly burned. Those who continued to observe Jewish practices faced imprisonment, torture, and execution. In 1 Maccabees 1 hours 63 minutes, it is written, "But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the Holy Covenant, and they did die." This passage illustrates the extent of the oppression and the profound spiritual crisis faced by the Jewish people during this period. The impact of these policies was deeply divisive within the Jewish community itself. Some Jews, particularly those in positions of power or influence, embraced Hellenization, seeing it as a means of achieving political stability or social acceptance. Others, however, remained steadfast in their faith, refusing to compromise their religious beliefs even under threat of death. This internal division created significant tension within Jewish society, as some viewed collaboration with the Seleucid authorities as treason against God and their covenant. It's essential to recognize that the first book of Maccabees does not merely serve as a historical chronicle, it provides a theological reflection on these events. The book portrays the conflict as more than just a political struggle. It is a spiritual battle between faithfulness to God and the forces of assimilation and idolatry. It emphasizes that the Jewish people's covenant with God was under attack and that their resistance was not merely a matter of political independence, but a defense of their spiritual integrity. In addition to recording the events of oppression and resistance, the first book of Maccabees serves as a reminder of the consequences of cultural compromise. It reflects on the danger of losing religious identity in the face of external pressures and highlights the resilience of those who chose faith over fear. The book also reinforces the idea that divine providence played a central role in sustaining the Jewish people during this period of profound crisis. The significance of this text extends beyond its historical narrative. It provides readers with a lens through which to understand the profound struggles faced by a community fighting to preserve its faith, its culture, and its relationship with God. It is not just a story of political rebellion, but also a story of spiritual endurance. In a time when silence seemed to stretch between the Old and New Testaments, the events chronicled in the first book of Maccabees serve as a bridge, reminding readers that God was still at work, guiding his people through their trials. Ultimately, the first book of Maccabees stands as a powerful testament to the resilience of faith under oppression. It challenges readers to reflect on their own commitments to their beliefs in times of hardship and to consider the cost of compromise in matters of faith. The book reminds us that the struggle to preserve one's spiritual and cultural identity is not confined to the ancient world. It is a timeless battle that continues to resonate with people of faith across generations. The first book of Maccabees captures one of the most significant and inspiring chapters in Jewish history, the Maccabean revolt. This was not merely a military uprising, but a spiritual and cultural struggle for survival. Under the oppressive rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jewish people faced a systematic attempt to erase their identity, desecrate their holiest sites, and force them to abandon their covenant with God. The revolt, led by the Maccabee family, was not only a desperate fight for freedom, but also a testament to unwavering faith, extraordinary leadership, and divine providence. The revolt began in the small town of Modi'in, where an elderly priest named Mattathias sparked the resistance. According to 1 Maccabees 2:15-22, when a Seleucid officer came to Modi'in and demanded that Matthias offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods, Matthias refused. When a fellow Jew stepped forward to comply with the officer's demands, Matthias, filled with righteous anger, killed both the officer and the compromising Jew. He then cried out, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out and follow me." 1 Maccabees 2:27. This bold act ignited the flame of rebellion. Matthias and his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, fled to the wilderness, gathering a growing force of Jewish rebels willing to risk everything to defend their faith and traditions. After Matthias's death in 166 BCE, his son Judas Maccabeus assumed leadership of the rebellion. Known as the Hammer, from the Hebrew word Maccabee, Judas became a symbol of resistance and a brilliant military strategist. Under his command, the Maccabees transformed from a ragtag group of rebels into a formidable fighting force. They adopted guerrilla warfare tactics, using the mountainous terrain of Judea to their advantage, launching surprise attacks on Seleucid forces, and then retreating to safety. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outarmed, Judas's deep faith and strategic brilliance turned the tide of the rebellion. One of the most significant victories came in the Battle of Emaus, around 165 BCE. The Seleucid general Gorgias led a heavily armed force to crush the rebellion. However, Judas anticipated Gorgias's tactics and launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp, while the main Seleucid force was away searching for the Maccabean rebels. The result was a stunning Jewish victory, as described in 1 Maccabees 4:24. They sang hymns and gave great praise to heaven, for his mercy endures forever. This victory was not just a military triumph, but a powerful spiritual statement that God was with the Jewish people in their struggle. Another pivotal moment was the Battle of Beth Zur, around 164 BCE, where Judas and his forces defeated a much larger Seleucid army led by Lysias, one of Antiochus IV's most trusted generals. The victory at Beth Zur allowed the Maccabees to secure control of Jerusalem and reclaim the Temple Mount. These victories demonstrated that faith, courage, and tactical brilliance could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Throughout the rebellion, Judas repeatedly emphasized that their strength came not from numbers or weapons, but from faith in God. In 1 Maccabees 3:18-19, he declares, "It is not the size of the army that brings victory in battle, but the strength that comes from heaven." This deep reliance on divine providence became the spiritual foundation of the revolt. For the Maccabees, every battle was not just a military engagement, but a sacred duty to defend the covenant God had made with their ancestors. The revolt was not without great sacrifices. The Seleucid forces often retaliated with brutality, massacring entire villages and torturing those suspected of aiding the Maccabees. The rebels faced hunger, exhaustion, and betrayal, yet their resolve never wavered. Judas Maccabeus emerged not only as a military leader but as a spiritual figure, reminding his people of God's promises and encouraging them to remain steadfast. The rebellion also revealed deep divisions within Jewish society. Some members of the Jewish aristocracy and priesthood had aligned themselves with the Seleucid rulers, adopting Greek customs and abandoning traditional Jewish practices. These Hellenized Jews often opposed the Maccabees, seeing them as fanatics disrupting the status quo. This internal conflict added another layer of complexity to the revolt, as Judas and his followers had to fight not only external enemies but also internal dissent. Despite these challenges, the Maccabean revolt was remarkably successful. The resilience of the Jewish rebels forced the Seleucid Empire to divert significant resources and manpower to suppress the uprising, weakening their grip on Judea. Eventually, Antiochus IV died in 164 BCE, and his successors struggled to maintain control over the rebellious province. The triumphs of the Maccabees were not merely military, they were deeply spiritual. The victories at Emos and Bethsa paved the way for the rededication of the Temple in Jerusalem, a sacred event that would be commemorated through the annual festival of Hanukkah. Although Judas Maccabeus would later fall in battle in 160 BCE, his legacy endured. His brothers, Jonathan and Simon Maccabeus, continued the struggle, eventually securing a period of independence for Judea under the Hasmonean dynasty, which ruled for nearly a century. The first book of Maccabees portrays the Maccabean revolt as not merely a war for political independence, but a fight to preserve faith, identity, and the covenant with God. The figure of Judas Maccabeus stands as a towering symbol of courage, devotion, and strategic brilliance. His leadership inspired not only his contemporaries, but also generations to come. After years of relentless struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering faith, the Maccabees, under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, achieved what once seemed impossible. They liberated Jerusalem from Seleucid control. However, their victory was not complete until the Temple in Jerusalem, the sacred heart of Jewish worship, was cleansed, restored, and rededicated to God of Israel. The temple had been desecrated under the orders of Antiochus for Epiphanes, where pagan altars were erected, unclean sacrifices were offered, and the holiness of the site was systematically violated. This was not just an assault on a building, it was an assault on the covenant between God and his people. When Judas and his forces entered Jerusalem, they were met with a heartbreaking sight. The once majestic temple stood in ruins, its altars defiled, its sacred vessels stolen, and its walls scarred by the presence of pagan idolatry. The first book of Maccabees 4:36-37 captures the gravity of this moment. Then Judas and his brothers said, "Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it anew." So they assembled the whole army and went up to Mount Zion. This was not merely a call to action, it was a declaration of spiritual renewal. The restoration of the temple was not just about bricks and mortar, it was about re-establishing the divine connection between the Jewish people and their God. The work of cleansing and restoring the temple began immediately. Judas Maccabeus and his followers dismantled the defiled altar of burnt offerings, stone by stone, as it could no longer be considered holy after being used for pagan sacrifices. In 1 Maccabees 4:43-44, it is written, They cleansed the sanctuary and carried away the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned. And they decided to tear it down so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. This meticulous care demonstrates the deep reverence the Maccabees held for the sanctity of the temple and their commitment to honoring God's laws. Once the altar was rebuilt, they proceeded to restore the sacred vessels, the lampstand, menorah, the table of the showbread, and the altar of incense. Everything was crafted according to the Torah's specifications, ensuring that the temple would once again be a fitting place for the presence of God. When all was ready, Judas and his followers lit the menorah, symbolizing the return of God's light to his people. The act of lighting the golden menorah holds profound spiritual significance. According to tradition, there was only enough consecrated oil to keep the lamp burning for 1 day, yet it miraculously burned for 8 days, the time needed to prepare more oil according to the ritual requirements. While the first book of Maccabees does not explicitly mention the miracle of the oil, it does emphasize the establishment of an 8-day celebration to commemorate the rededication of the temple. In 1 Maccabees 4:59, it is written, "Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev." This marks the origin of Hanukkah, also known as the Festival of Lights, a celebration that continues to be observed by Jewish communities around the world to this day. The rededication of the temple was not merely a ritual act, it was a spiritual and national victory. It symbolized the restoration of God's presence among his people and the reaffirmation of their covenant with him. For the Jewish people, the temple was not just a place of worship, it was the center of their spiritual identity, a tangible sign of their unique relationship with the divine. Its cleansing and rededication were not just about reclaiming a physical structure, but about reclaiming their faith, their identity, and their future. In addition to its spiritual significance, the restoration of the temple also had profound political and social implications. It served as a rallying point for the Jewish people, bringing together those who had been divided by fear, doubt, and the influence of Hellenization. The temple's rededication marked a moment of unity and collective triumph, reminding the people of what could be achieved through faith, courage, and determination. The establishment of Hanukkah ensured that the memory of this miraculous period would endure for generations. The lighting of the menorah each year serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness, the resilience of the Jewish people, and the enduring power of hope in the face of darkness. Each flickering flame tells a story, not just of military triumph, but of spiritual renewal and divine intervention. The rededication of the temple also became a powerful symbol of resistance against assimilation. The Maccabees' victory was not just over the Seleucid Empire, but over the forces of cultural erasure and spiritual compromise. The temple stood as a beacon of Jewish faith and identity, a physical representation of the people's refusal to abandon their covenant with God, even under the most severe persecution. It is important to recognize that the restoration of the temple did not mark the end of struggles for the Jewish people. The Seleucids would continue to launch campaigns to reclaim Judea, and the Maccabees would face new challenges in the years to come. Yet, the cleansing and rededication of the temple provided a spiritual foundation upon which future generations could stand, a moment where faith overcame fear, light overcame darkness, and the covenant was renewed. The first book of Maccabees captures this event with reverence and precision, ensuring that the sacrifices, faith, and victories of the Maccabees would not be forgotten. The restoration of the temple is not just a historical milestone, it is a timeless reminder that faith can triumph over oppression, that even in the darkest times, God's light cannot be extinguished. Each year, as Jewish families around the world gather to light the Hanukkah menorah, they are not merely participating in a ritual, they are rekindling the same light that burned in the temple thousands of years ago, a light that symbolizes God's presence, providence, and unyielding love for his people. The legacy of the Maccabean revolt, as recorded in the first book of Maccabees, extends far beyond the military victories and the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem. Its impact resonates not only in the history of the Jewish people, but also in the cultural, religious, and political landscapes of subsequent generations. The revolt was not merely a localized uprising against a foreign power, it was a profound statement about the resilience of faith, identity, and cultural preservation in the face of systemic oppression. The first book of Maccabees, serving both as a historical record and a spiritual document, has preserved this legacy for millennia, offering invaluable insights into the enduring power of faith, the cost of freedom, and the consequences of compromise. One of the most immediate and tangible results of the Maccabean revolt was the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, a Jewish royal line descended from the Maccabees. After the initial victories and the rededication of the temple, the Maccabean family transitioned from military leaders into political rulers. Under the Hasmoneans, Judea experienced a period of relative independence, free from the direct control of foreign empires. This era marked a rare moment in Jewish history when the people of Judea governed themselves according to their own laws, customs, and religious traditions. The Hasmoneans also expanded their territory, reclaiming lands that had been lost and uniting the Jewish people under a single banner. However, this period was not without its challenges. Internal divisions, power struggles, and the eventual intervention of the Roman Empire would bring the Hasmonean dynasty to an end. Despite this, the establishment of Jewish self-rule remains one of the lasting triumphs of the Maccabean revolt. Beyond its political ramifications, the Maccabean revolt had profound religious and spiritual consequences. The revolt was fundamentally a battle to preserve the covenant between God and his people, a covenant threatened by the forced imposition of Greek religion and culture. By reclaiming the temple, re-establishing proper worship, and restoring Jewish practices, the Maccabees safeguarded not only a physical space but also the spiritual heart of their faith. The rededication of the temple and the subsequent celebration of Hanukkah became a perpetual reminder of God's faithfulness and the importance of remaining steadfast in one's beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The menorah, lit every year during Hanukkah, serves as a symbol of hope, divine intervention, and the unyielding spirit of those who refuse to abandon their faith. The first book of Maccabees plays a vital role in preserving and transmitting these lessons. Written as a historical narrative, the book goes beyond mere documentation of events, it provides a theological interpretation of the revolt. It portrays the Maccabees not just as military heroes, but as instruments of God's divine will, chosen to defend his covenant and restore the sanctity of the temple. The book emphasizes key themes that remain relevant across generations: the cost of faithfulness, the courage to resist assimilation, and the power of divine providence. These themes continue to inspire not only Jewish communities but also people of faith worldwide, serving as a reminder that true freedom often requires great sacrifice. In addition to its spiritual and historical significance, the revolt also had a profound cultural impact. It underscored the importance of preserving one's cultural identity in the face of external pressures to conform. The Maccabees fought not just for political autonomy, but for the right to live according to their traditions, to observe their laws, and to worship their God without interference. This message remains strikingly relevant in a world where cultural and religious identities are often challenged by globalization, political power struggles, and societal pressure to conform to prevailing norms. The Maccabean revolt stands as a timeless example of how a small group of dedicated individuals can resist cultural erasure and preserve their identity against seemingly insurmountable odds. The influence of the Maccabean revolt is also evident in the New Testament period. By the time of Jesus Christ, the political and religious landscape of Judea had been deeply shaped by the events of the Maccabean era. The memory of the Maccabees' resistance and the rededication of the temple lingered in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people. In the Gospel of John 10 verses 22 to 23, Jesus is described as walking in the temple during the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, a direct reference to the events recorded in the first book of Maccabees. This connection highlights the enduring importance of the Maccabean legacy in shaping the world into which Jesus was born and carried out his ministry. Furthermore, the first book of Maccabees serves as an essential historical source for understanding the intertestamental period, the era between the Old and New Testaments. This period is often referred to as a time of silence, where prophetic voices seemed absent. Yet, the events of the Maccabean revolt reveal that God was still at work, guiding his people through courageous leaders like Judas Maccabeus and his family. The book bridges the gap between the two testaments, showing how the political and religious tensions of the Maccabean era set the stage for the coming of Christ. Another lasting impact of the Maccabean revolt is its message about leadership and sacrifice. Matthias, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon Maccabeus were not born into power, they rose to leadership because of their unwavering commitment to their faith and people. Their sacrifices remind us that true leadership is not about authority or privilege, but about servanthood, courage, and selflessness. These values continue to resonate in leadership principles across religious, political, and social spheres. In conclusion, while the Maccabean revolt may have been a localized struggle in its time, its echoes have been felt throughout history. The first book of Maccabees stands as a testament to the enduring power of faith, courage, and resilience. It preserves the story of a people who refused to bow to oppression, who clung to their identity in the face of annihilation, and who triumphed against overwhelming odds. The celebration of Hanukkah, the symbol of the menorah, and the legacy of the Maccabees serve as powerful reminders that light can overcome darkness, faith can conquer fear, and hope can prevail even in the most desperate of circumstances. Through the words of the first book of Maccabees, the spirit of the Maccabees continues to inspire generations, calling each of us to stand firm in our convictions and remain steadfast in our faith, no matter the cost. The first book of Maccabees is more than just a historical account of rebellion, triumph, and perseverance. It is a profound narrative filled with spiritual lessons and timeless truths that continue to resonate with readers today. The story of the Maccabees transcends its historical context, offering insights into the nature of faith, leadership, sacrifice, and the human spirit's resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. At its core, the Maccabean story is a testament to the power of unwavering faith in God, the importance of standing firm for one's beliefs, and the transformative impact of courage guided by divine providence. One of the most compelling lessons from the Maccabean story is the value of faithfulness under pressure. The Jewish people, led by Matthias, Judas Maccabeus, and their family, refused to compromise their faith, even when facing death, torture, and oppression. In 1 Maccabees 2:19-22, Matthias declares with unwavering resolve, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and forsake the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my kindred will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors." This powerful declaration encapsulates the spirit of the Maccabean revolt. It reminds us that faith is not truly tested in times of peace and security, but in moments of trial and persecution. In a world where compromise can often seem like the easier path, the story of the Maccabees calls believers to remain steadfast, to hold tightly to their convictions, and to trust in God's promises, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Another profound lesson is the cost of courage and sacrifice. The Maccabees were not professional soldiers, they were ordinary people, priests, farmers, and villagers who rose up against a powerful empire because they believed their cause was just. Their sacrifices were immense. Many of them left behind their homes, livelihoods, and families, knowing that resistance could cost them their lives. Yet, they pressed forward, driven by a sense of divine calling and an unyielding belief in their covenant with God. The courage displayed by Judas Maccabeus on the battlefield, the unwavering faith of those who resisted cultural assimilation, and the sacrifices of countless unnamed martyrs remind us that true courage often demands great personal cost. Leadership is another central theme woven throughout the first book of Maccabees. The Maccabean leaders, Matthias, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon, demonstrated a unique blend of spiritual conviction and practical wisdom. They understood that their mission was not merely to win military victories, but to restore the faith and identity of their people. Leadership, as portrayed in the story of the Maccabees, is not about seeking power or prestige, but about servanthood, sacrifice, and a deep sense of responsibility toward one's people and one's faith. Judas Maccabeus, in particular, emerges not only as a brilliant military strategist, but also as a spiritual leader who reminded his followers that their strength came not from weapons or numbers, but from God's divine favor. In 1 Maccabees 3:18-19, Judas declares, "It is not the size of the army that brings victory in battle, but the strength that comes from heaven." This principle serves as a timeless reminder for leaders in every generation. True strength comes from reliance on God, not on human resources alone. The story of the Maccabees also highlights the importance of cultural and spiritual identity. The revolt was not just a military campaign, it was a fight to preserve the Jewish way of life, their traditions, and their covenant with God. In a world where assimilation and cultural erosion remain ever-present threats, the Maccabees stand as a powerful example of a people who refuse to let their faith and identity be stripped away. The temple's desecration was not just an affront to a building, but an attack on the soul of a nation. By rededicating the temple and restoring proper worship, the Maccabees not only reclaimed a sacred space, but also reaffirmed their commitment to God and His commandments. The establishment of the festival of Hanukkah, born out of the rededication of the temple, serves as an enduring symbol of hope, light, and divine intervention. Every year, as Jewish families light the Hanukkah menorah, they are reminded of the miraculous events that took place during the Maccabean revolt. The menorah's flames are more than just a historical commemoration. They represent God's faithfulness in times of darkness, His provision in times of scarcity, and His ability to bring victory out of defeat. The celebration of Hanukkah also serves as a call to all generations to remember, reflect, and rededicate themselves to God, just as Judas and his followers rededicated the temple. Furthermore, the first book of Maccabees teaches us about the consequences of internal division. One of the greatest challenges the Maccabees faced was not just the external threat posed by the Seleucid Empire, but the internal divisions within the Jewish community itself. Some Jews, seduced by the promise of power and acceptance, willingly adopted Hellenistic customs and abandoned their traditions. This division weakened their collective strength and made resistance more difficult. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromise and disunity in the face of external threats. In a broader sense, the Maccabean story challenges readers to consider what they are willing to stand for and sacrifice for their faith. In a world filled with competing ideologies, shifting values, and relentless pressures to conform, the example of the Maccabees serves as a clarion call to remain steadfast, courageous, and faithful. It asks us, what are we willing to risk for our beliefs? How far will we go to defend our faith and honor God? The first book of Maccabees ultimately leaves readers with a deep sense of hope and responsibility. Hope, because it shows that even in the darkest moments, God remains faithful to His people and empowers them to overcome impossible odds. Responsibility, because the story reminds each generation of the importance of preserving their faith, teaching it to their children, and passing on the legacy of courage and resilience. The story of the Maccabees is not confined to the pages of ancient history, it continues to speak to us today. It reminds us that faith can triumph over fear, light can overcome darkness, and conviction can outlast compromise. Whether in moments of personal struggle, societal pressure, or spiritual doubt, the lessons of the Maccabees challenge us to rise up, stand firm, and trust in the God who guides, sustains, and delivers His people.